work that you have to buy, right? The work that's so bad we give it away for free. And the work that's so bad that I pay you to read it. Well, I think that mine is in the second of those categories. Look, it's lovely to be with you. You have in your hands 3 documents, I think, most of you, I hope. One is this extract from this week's New Statesman, which just by chance tells you the story of Jeremy Corbyn's rise to power inside the Labour Party. And for those of us who are British Labour Party enthusiasts, that story is a very important one. But actually, for the rest of us, we're dealing with more broadly with European issues, the detail is less important than the result, namely that the British Labour Party has started to refocus itself as a genuine party of the centre-left, looking leftwards, which is what I want to talk to you about today. We have just published Reflections on the Future of the Left, which is a collection of essays, literally yesterday, I think it came out in London, which brings together, as you'll see if you read the back of the copy of it, some major intellectual figures from my generation of centre-left and revolutionary left socialists. Trying to do again what had happened once in Britain before, which was in 1979 when Eric Hobsbawm had written a book about the forward march of Labour halted, and there'd been a big period of reflection on why Margaret Thatcher had happened. Well, in the context of Brexit, clearly, not to mention our wonderful new president here, it seemed the right time to look again, but this particular set of essays, and I want to talk to you about I'm going to talk from mine in that collection for you this morning. I mean, the track record of my generation, the legacy we're leaving you, is not great, to put it politely. And so we thought it would be appropriate to look back and discuss what had gone wrong and what hopefully will soon go right, so that at least on the centre-left, the baton can begin to pass from one generation to the next. And this little collection of essays is going to be followed by another one edited by a friend and colleague who's 30 years younger, who actually will get his generation together to write those essays. So I wanted to talk, rather than different than the talks I've given in the past, I wanted to talk to you in general about the state of the left in Europe, particularly in Europe, but also to some degree here in the United States. But if anybody in the room is a deeply committed Republican and conservative, well, I'm sorry for this. For me, I'm happy to talk to you, but that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the state of the centre left. And you have in front of you the other sheet of paper, a layout of what I want to say, the 7 points I want to hit with you, and it has the back as well. So my hope is that in the next 40 minutes, 45 minutes, I will work down those 7 questions points with you, getting to the question of agency, and in the process we'll talk about what's on the back of that sheet, and then throw the floor open to you to talk to me. Okay? So let me make some introductory remarks. I mean, the first one I would say to you is this: if further proof was needed that one swallow does not make a summer, try comparing the performance of the Labour Party in the UK's June 2017 election with that of the French Socialist Party in the elections for the National Assembly, the first round of which occurred just 3 days after the UK election. In both cases, centre-left parties went down to expected defeat, but whereas in the British election, the Labour Party's unexpectedly strong performance cost the Conservative government its majority, in the French case, the Socialist Party and its allies, who'd been in government as recently as the previous month, if you remember, lost all but 44 of the 284 seats they had. It was a disaster for the French Socialist Party. Given that the French performance was by far the more typical of the two, given recent results both in Europe and here in the United States, it remains the case, I think, that leaving aside the rather unusual election results in the UK, these are not great days for the centre-left, and they're even less satisfactory for the revolutionary left, and that 2017 marks the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, but it's not been a spectacular century in those kinds of politics either. So it seemed a good time to sort of reflect back on what had happened, particularly in the immediate past, see whether we can learn some lessons on how we might go forward doing rather better than we are doing at the moment. I mean, there's a sense in which I get, it's a real sense from my colleagues on both sides of the Atlantic, that the 2017 UK election stands out now as kind of an oasis of hope. In other words, a pretty bleak set of conditions. We'll see what happens in Germany on Sunday, but in general, what the left has got used to lately is losing big, losing regularly, and so on. We have got to get out of that habit. And it's worth remembering that it's less than 20 years ago that the Labour Party came to power in Britain in 1997, inflicting on the Conservative Party that Margaret Thatcher had once led its biggest electoral defeat since 1846. Now, Spencer said I've been in the business a long time, but even I wasn't teaching in 1846. It was a long time ago, right? And in 2008, of course, Barack Obama swept into power, and the White House was just saying, yes, we can, yes, we can. And where are we now? You know, we've got ultra-libertarian Republicans poised to take away healthcare from 32 million of their fellow citizens. We've got Charlton for president, and in the UK, we've got Brexit, with all the joys that is poised to release on the British economy and society, and that with the minority government actually dependent on the DUP of all people to keep it in power. So things are not as good now as they once were, and we need to know why. And it's also the case, I think, that the 2017 election in the UK sends a very strong signal to all of us about the state of the centre-left generally. There was such huge relief the day after the snap election in June that the Labour Party just lost it. The expectation was they were going to get annihilated. No, in fact, they increased their proportion of the vote back to 40%. Jeremy Corbyn did very well and he consolidated his position. But we have got ourselves to such a level of lack of confidence that being defeated marginally feels like an enormous victory. We've got somehow to get ourselves out of that mental framework back into a much more assertive one. The question is how. Well, in order to see how, we have to put certain pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together. There are plenty of people telling us that the prospects for the centre-left are so bleak we should give up the whole game. And my argument back to them has been that if you give up the whole game, the future is austerity politics and increasingly ultra-conservative republicanism here. And if you give up the game, you forget the fact that the centre-left in particular, has had bleak periods before from which they've come. So rather than give up the game, what we need to do is to put together an understanding of why we're in this particular hole, what's the significance of the hole, and how the hell do we get out of it, right? It's a three-stage operation. And the first thing is to look at the nature of the hole. Why is the centre-left in the UK, in the United States now with the defeat of Hillary Clinton by Donald Trump, in France, great chunks of Western Europe? Why is it doing so badly? And I think there are four contextual things that we need to, in the immediate political context, that we need to recognise. The first is that on both sides of the Atlantic, significant numbers of voters in traditionally left-wing constituencies have, in recent elections, stopped voting for centre-left parties. They've turned instead either to conservative parties that offer a more mainstream message, or turning away from both mainstream political currents altogether, have become enthusiastic supporters of right-wing populism and right-wing populist figures. So this working class realignment away from the centre, not of course uniquely American or British, but it is a very defining feature of the politics of both the United States and the United Kingdom in the last half decade. Donald Trump gathered critical working class votes in key swing states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and in Ohio. And in the UK, of course, in 2016, in the referendum that year, right-wing conservatives and the crude nationalism of the United Kingdom Independence Party took the UK out of the European Union. So the first thing that's happening is that the centre-left is losing some of its traditional left-wing support. The second thing which we need to bring to the table to understand that is why. What is it happening? What is happening that's triggering this real degree of working class political realignment? And I think I'm sure we know this, but many traditionally left-leaning voters seem to have turned away from their normal political loyalties, in part because of the severity of the economic and social conditions to which they are increasingly exposed. We could talk about this particular point at length, and perhaps we should afterwards. But you must understand that the way the electoral bloc first formed was in the years of the Cold War. And it was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War that then opened the whole of the labour markets, labour supply rather, of the global economy to competition with itself. But prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, class compacts were established in Western capitalism, which worked on the premise that labour was in short supply, and therefore there were genuine deals done. And then 25 years of post-communism later, outsourcing and so on, mobilization of the Chinese peasantry and moving them into factories. You're just into a very different set of labour market conditions. And that realignment in the post-Cold War period coincides, of course, with the years of neoliberal ascendancy inside the West itself, which came as a result, produced massive income inequality, and of course, and we'll come back to this later, those years of neoliberal ascendancy came to a dead stop in September 2008, the biggest financial crisis since 1929, with 50 million people out of work globally, virtually overnight. Both the inequality of the neoliberal condition, the recession, and the pressure on wages hit large chunks of the centre-left working class electoral base very hard. So it's scarcely surprising, I think, that as more and more people found their own economic circumstances depleted and the prospects for their children diminished, that they should have shifted their political allegiance to parties who had no authorial responsibility for those adverse developments, and to parties that, because they were not responsible for those conditions, could address them openly and offer ostensibly simple solutions for their resolution. Now, the third thing which goes with that is this: that crash in 2008 was enormous, wasn't it? It touched everybody, and you would expect, wouldn't you, given that it was a crash of a deregulated financial system, that everybody would turn back and become Keynesians and financial market regulators again. And there was a moment, I'm sure everybody in this room will remember it, when Wall Street executives had to apologize for the scale of their bonuses, when there was genuinely a shift to the left. And we expected it would just keep going, but, and it's a story to talk about perhaps later, it did not occur. Within two years of that recession, that September crisis, in 2 years, the Republican Party in the United States and the Conservatives in Britain had won electoral power again, arguing that in fact the crisis was caused by the government overspending, rather than the government overspending being the only reason why the crisis was not worse than it actually turned out to be. So there was a great moving right show, which actually the centre-left failed to block. And they failed to block it, it's going to be a very important part of what I say to you in a few minutes, they failed to block it because in a very large measure, by the time the financial crisis broke in 2008, responsibility for the deregulation of the financial sector was a responsibility shared by the centre-left parties and the parties of the centre-right. So there's a sense in which, when the whole thing came down, it wasn't possible for the Labour Party Britain or the Democrats in the United States to get long-term electoral mileage out of it. That's something we need to talk about much later. But the fourth, which touches you lot, I think, very directly, is this. One of the final things that's happened is the European Union itself has lost a lot of its elan in centre-left circles inside and beyond the European Union because of the growth of neoliberal orthodoxies inside the European Union itself. I mean, this is not a problem, I should tell you, for the, no, I'm talking about this morning, for the Democratic Party. I mean, Bernie Sanders, after all, tried to sell himself as a good Danish social democrat, didn't he? Telling you that Europe was doing it right, and everybody should go live in Denmark. Bloody crowded if they did, wouldn't they? I mean, it's a very, very tiny place, right? So not a good idea. Well, the bacon works. But the fact that the European Union under German leadership was actually doing such terrible things to Greece and so on by this time, was going through its own crisis, meant that one of the ways in which centre-left politics in general had demonstrated superiority to the politics of the centre-right was to look to the European Union, to look to the whole notion of social partnership, to look to the quality of welfare capitalism that European guys. and then suddenly we found on the contrary that, particularly after the Eurozone crisis of 2010, that was actually not a very good model anymore. So the question is, how do we get back on track, given that these particular contextual factors are so inimical to the rise again of a self-confident and popular and widely supported centre-left progressive project? Right. Well, I have an answer to that, which is what I'd like to share with everybody, and it requires me to get it into place. I need you to come with me on another intellectual journey for a minute, right? The second piece of the jigsaw. Right? All that about context, but there's something about history that I must talk to you about. Because if we are to understand what our position now, we have to place it historically. We have to know where it sits in a long-term storyline. And the question is, how do we do that? Now, what I want to say to you is we are in a period of transition between one great social settlement and the one that needs to be created by the centre-left. And in order to understand what I mean by that, I need to talk to you about the post-war economic history of the entire capitalist bloc. And I've got to do it by 10 to 1. So this will be a bit schematic, right? No crying for details. I think it's worth recognizing that capitalism, as a way of generating economic growth, works well when there is a social settlement around it that softens for a while the central contradictions between capital and labour that actually normally weaken. So that in fact it's worth understanding history as a period when those settlements are in place, and then a period when they're not in place, and another one comes in, and so on. And they're never permanently in place, because in the end, the contradictions that are being held at bay resurface. Now, with that in mind, my sense is that the latest successful settlement, that was the one put in place in the 1980s by Margaret Thatcher in the UK and by Ronald Reagan in the United States, that one is now well past its sell-by date. You know, it came to bits in 2008, and we are in that sense living downwind of that particular deconstruction of a successful social settlement. And the job of the progressives is to get us to another one, recognizing what in fact we have to do to get there. I'll come to that in a minute. But if you've got this sense of us now being in a transitional decade now, since 2008, almost 10 years since the financial crisis, and we're not out of this transition door, if you've got that sense in your head of that, then some of you at least I'm sure will remember, or have read rather, that the 1970s was a similarly difficult period. Because in fact, the Thatcher-Reagan settlement that came out of the 1970s was the second post-war settlement, not the first. The first post-war settlement, the one that generated 25 years of economic growth across the entire capitalist bloc, that saw the reconstruction of the German growth machine that put Japan back together. That was a social settlement put together under New Deal leadership and under the leadership of the Labour Party in Britain in the years after 1945, and it was Keynesian in its core, and it was actually based, for those of you who like your economics, it was based on Fordism. It was based on the generalized application to one manufacturing sector after another of semi-automated production systems that had been first consolidated during building weapons during the Second World War. Fordism was that growth machine at the bottom of the first social settlement. It generated full employment for a generation. It made workers sufficiently scarce that they had to be paid proper wages, and in the process of doing that, it gave the supply side of the economy a demand side that balanced it. And you've got productivity, prices, productivity, wages, and profits all going up together for a generation. It came to bits because in the end, what happened was that you ran out of industries whose productivity could be raised by the application of Fordism. You know, the productivity flattened out in the 70s. The unions were well organized. They fought for wages. Prices started to go up. All hell and its mother broke loose. And in the end, in Britain, there was a winter discontent. In the United States, there was Jimmy Carter, and out of that came Thatcherism and Reaganism in the United States. And the new social settlement they made was qualitatively different. How can I explain this to everybody? I can make this up because there's virtually no exceptions. I'm the only person around who can remember this. Margaret Thatcher frightened the living daylights out of you. She got increased productivity by making sure you stayed at work longer, worked harder, and didn't complain, because if you did, you'd lose your job. There was a whole period of intensification of the labour process in the early years of Thatcher-Reagan settlement. It paralleled the defeat of the air traffic controllers here in the United States and the spread of right-to-work republicanism, right, getting rid of unions and so on. And then when it looked like it was going to run into the buffers, because there's only so many hours you can work in a day before you drop an exhaustion by the size of your machine, along came IT and computers, and suddenly we had a whole new boost of productivity, didn't we, in the 1990s? You right up, right? In that process, we got a second wave of this settlement. Political control was passed to Tony Blair in Britain and to Bill Clinton in the United States. They were New Democrats and New Labour took it on, but they kept basically the Thatcherite-Reagan model going. They didn't reconstitute strong trade unions. They didn't do very much about working hours, and wages remained stagnant for a generation. What happened in that second settlement was that people maintained their living standards. The demand side of the equation was sustained by people doing three remarkable things. One is they worked longer and longer hours. So in the US economy, by the end of the 1990s, people were working on average about 140 hours a year more than their predecessors had done in the 1970s, which is, do the math, that's nearly 40-hour weeks. So you work longer hours. They sent every member of the family out to work. The cat, the dog, the children, but particularly their partner, so you've got two-income families, and then all the questions of work-life balance, childcare, and so on started to intensify, of course. And the third thing people did was to run up personal debt. Massive amounts of personal debt. There were times, if you were lucky enough to own a house, the house inflation in the United Kingdom in the 1990s was so great that my house earned more on a day than I did. It was worth more by 5 o'clock in the evening than I'd earned on that day. People ran up them, they maxed out their credit cards. They used their houses like ATM machines if they got them. And all that came to a staggering halt in 2008 with the collapse of the financial crisis, the housing bubble, and so on. People suddenly ended up with vast amounts of negative equity. Now, because that is so, people panicked. And they turned initially against the party that happened to be in power in 2008. In the US case, George W. Bush was in power. Remember, in September 2008, he abandoned trickle-down economics overnight. He abandoned deregulation of business overnight. Henry Paulson came in and got 23 bankers in a room and told them to save the American economy. Barack Obama won that election because John McCain was a Republican. By the same token, Gordon Brown did much the same kind of job, but in 2010, New Labour being So what I want to emphasize to you is, as we look now at the state of the centre-left, we have to recognize that we're dealing with a centre-left party that are downwind of a major financial crisis that actually gutted the social settlement within which they'd all operated for a generation. And there's a footnote to that. Let me say this to you. 2020 hindsight is brilliant stuff. But if we'd been having this conversation in September 2006, we'd assumed that the kind of growth package that Reagan and Thatcher and now Clinton and Blair were orchestrating, which was working clearly in Germany very well on much shorter hours, and Swedes as well, that was going to go on forever. And in those periods of stability like that, when you have this, what happens is that politics gets really easy and rather low-key, because you have a political class that's entirely at ease with itself, and there are no fundamental issues to talk about. It's just which one's better at handling, keeping the thing afloat and so on. And you then tend to get very stable periods of the same party in power and so on. But when you hit one of these transitions, when the thing comes down, breaks, as it did so dramatically in 2008, then suddenly politics is much harder. And it's much harder for this reason. It's much harder because you've got somehow to shift the whole social settlement to something else that will work again. And you've got to do that while coping with the fact that your electorate is struggling to make sense of what's happening to them now. And Antonio Gramsci said that when he was faced with Mussolini, it was a very appropriate parallel given we've got Donald Trump. He said in the 1930s that you get a crisis when precisely in the fact that the old order is dying and a new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, he said, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Well, you don't come much more morbid than Nigel Farage and the United Kingdom Independence Party. They don't come much more morbid than Donald Trump right now. We are in a period of transition here. And the reason why it's difficult for the centre-left to pick up but to benefit from the crisis and move through it. The major reason why that's a problem for people on the centre-left is that they were themselves authors of the thing that, partial authors of the thing that collapsed. If you just go back a little, I'm probably wondering why I'm pointing to it. In the 1970s, in the end, the collapse of the Keynesian post-war settlement gave, as Margaret Thatcher, and it gave us the Republicans and Conservatives, because the authors of that New Deal settlement were centre-left social democrats in the European case, New Deal American Democrats and so on. So they have built their politics for a generation saying we can use Keynesian techniques to keep the ship afloat. And of course, the one thing that Keynesianism always says to you is either you have unemployment or you have inflation. If you have unemployment, you increase government spending. If you've got inflation, you cut government spending. They've been doing it that way, keeping the ship afloat through the 50s and 60s. And suddenly you had inflation and unemployment together. And the whole thing was stopped. You couldn't get out of it. So they paid a very heavy electoral price, particularly the British Labour Party. It was out of power nearly 20 years as it tried to pick itself up from that crisis. It did so by turning itself Thatcher-like. It did so by going New Labour, and in that sense, taking authority responsibility for the Thatcher-Reagan growth model and just simply saying to people, we are more civilized Thatcherites than they are, and we can do things they can't do. And they did things that the Thatcher people didn't do. In the British case, they were very, very good on childcare, right from day one. But actually, in the end, they got caught with the collapse of the whole thing. And it's because that they now have that problem. When people think about the bad years of the 2008, the Labour Party is associated with it in their mind. That Labour, for the minute, continues to struggle to win a parliamentary majority. And again, this is only a detail for Labour buffs. I mean, Ed Miliband led the Labour Party from 2010 to 2015, somebody of whom I'm extraordinarily fond. And Ed got on television just before the 2015 election and was barracked by the audience when he said, no, we didn't cause the crisis by overspending. We overspent because the crisis required a government response. And by 2015, people thought that was fake news. When you go back, of course, look, it was exactly true. So they had failed to get the message. So, in fact, if the Labour Party and currently the Democrats here are going to ever break that credibility gap, they've got to make a sharp break with their own past. Get rid of the Blairites, get rid of the Clinton people, and go forward. And what is so attractive to me about the Corbyn part of this story is that that is beginning to happen. In fact, we are beginning to go post-Blair, post-New Labour in the UK case, and we are seeing the Labour Party picking up its electoral base again, consolidating again, because it's moving to the left. Now, just talk to you a bit about new needs and old solutions, so that we can see why I'm so cheered about what Corbyn may be doing and why I'm so hopeful that if the Democratic Party makes in the end the break with the Clinton period, that we may see a rapid return to a stronger Democratic Party here as the excesses of the Trump period become so obvious. New needs and old solutions. That part of the key paper you have. this by way of context. Again. When these big settlements collapse, they leave shadows, they leave legacies, they leave agendas that then shape life for a period of time. So it was the case in the 70s that the big legacy that was left was inflation. Inflation was running at over almost 20% at one point in the 1970s. In fact, there was a moment in the 1970s when the National Union of Railwaymen went on national strike because they were only offered a 28% pay rise because inflation had just cost 30% and that was a wage cut, you know. And everybody was terrified they were going down that Latin American route of hyperinflation where your money's worthless like that. Inflation was a big problem, you know. It was a huge problem. Now, the legacy of the collapse of the Reagan-Thatcher one is different. I mean, there are three legacies, I think, that I see around it all the time. You'll recognize them. I mean, one is the deindustrialization of the base of the US and UK economies, particularly the UK economy. The second is what we call the Walmart syndrome, the wage race to the bottom. You know, the fact that American and British jobs are being outsourced, leaving only low-wage service employment available in any volume for large sections of each working class, and so consolidating a retail sector selling shoddy goods made abroad that are all that low-wage American and British workers can now afford. And let me tell you, though, the figures are not so acute in here, they're very acute in Britain. Britain is slipping back into a growth model based on massive amounts of personal debt. And the Bank of England is sending out warning signals. Have you seen the debt numbers again, rising up again? The same thing might happen again. And the third, because is that's a response to lack of adequate levels of demand within the system, because wages are going down, wages are held down, and you've got what they call secular stagnation. So what we have got to do is twofold. One of the, we've got to recognise you can't do an old Keynesian spend and tax and spend. Yeah, this one it won't work on its own. But nor does austerity politics work either. I mean, if you cut government spending, then you just intensify the lack of demand in the system. What you've got to do, and you drive people off from hanging on to their living standards for the moment by accumulating debt or by intensifying their work process or lengthening their hours of work. And in the 2015 British election, 2017 election, the snap election, Theresa May called it. There was much public discussion of this thing called the jam families, the just getting by families. Families feeling that, you know, they're just on the edge of a major financial crisis, people realizing they've got about no savings left, £300 or £400, and it ain't a big problem, they'll be in big problems and so on. So it's quite clear if you come in that situation and start cutting taxes and services, then given the size of the public sector in the United Kingdom in particular, you start to compound and consolidate and make worse of the problems. So what you've got to do is to get back to a kind of economics where people raise their living standards by spending the wages they're earning now, not the wages that they're borrowing on, the wages down the future, you know, that they're borrowing on to pay through their credit card. And to do that, to make sure there is enough money in the system to sustain the demand side of the equation, you've got to do something about the massive growth of income inequality, which has eroded that capacity in each system over time. I mean, what happens now, of course, as I'm sure people realize, is there's an enormous redistribution of income going up. The top 20%, possibly top 10% even more. Bernie Sanders would just have it as a 1% or whatever. But there is massive income inequality. If you have, I fantasize about this myself. If I have lots of money, what would I do with it? You know, well, I put it in the bank probably and lend it to you lot at disgustingly high rates of interest. Because that's what you do. You take the money, they put it in their own bank account, they lend it back to you, and they charge you for the privilege of getting your own money back. It's a complete con. But it's how the system is working, and what you've got to do is to turn it around. You've got to get the wages back into the system. And the other thing you have to do is to make sure on the supply side that the quality of the goods and services coming into people are of high quality. And to do that, you have to make sure that the people making them have the time, the energy, the skills, and the commitment to make things well. So it becomes absolutely vital that people coming to work are not arriving at work shattered, having got the kids on the school bus at 6:30 and then iron 4 shirts and dash to the supermarket and all the things that actually now constitute the joys of modern parenting. I mean, we need to have 2-income families working and being conditioned to work well. And it's putting those two things together that is the need for, would then generate a social settlement that will sustain itself for another generation. And the question is, who's even thinking like that to make that thing happen? Now, what's certainly not happening on the right in both the United States and in large chunks of Europe, certainly in United Kingdom, is people are trying to do something else. They're not buying the argument, they're not even thinking this way, that their Reagan-Thatcher model is past its sell-by date. What they're trying to do is keep it going as much as possible because they believe in free markets and all that good stuff. Because it worked in the 90s, so it's going to work again. The right is not coming into this conversation with anything new to offer, just more austerity, more pain. What the centre-left has to do is to lift its game, as it were, and come in with policies that can create a new progressive settlement around both economies. Now, this final bit on the new needs or solutions. If you look at the second bullet point, it says the need for more equality that I just made, but more productivity. In the end, these settlements work, people's living standards grow only if the general productivity of labour rises inside the economy. What's happening now, of course, is labour productivity is going down or being held back because so many people are working in labour-intensive, low-capitalised service industries, and there's been no significant breakthrough into a new productivity paradigm. Now, there's a literature around, I'm sure some of you read it, that maybe we are on the edge of a new technological breakthrough that's going to lift productivity again, associated with robots, and in artificial intelligence. I mean, I came in Ireland's great little Fiat car, one that sounds like a Boeing 727 that it zooms into. Right? But we put it in the garage last week and we were lent a modern car. This car had so many buttons it could drive itself. In fact, it was terrifying. I'm in the car park and I pressed the button, the bloody engine came on, and I wasn't even in the car. So it may be that we are on the edge of some kind of technological breakthrough that will do it again, which is terrific. Let's do it. Right? But if not, if our job is to get more productivity out of our existing capital stock and labour force, there only are about 6 ways of doing that. Actually, you can put more investment in. You should have an awful lot of public spending for investment purposes, like infrastructure, for example. Right? And you should do it now because borrowing is so cheap, and that's being canvassed by people like Wolfgang and so on. You can improve the quality of your labour force by skills training, of course you can. You can strengthen your small and medium-sized sector by improving the spread of innovation across the whole economy. You can shift the Swedish way of shifting labour out of low productivity sectors into high productivity sectors. You can keep everybody fully employed. There's still an awful lot of unemployment in this economy. But my own personal preference, the big one, I did those 5 quickly, but so I could do the 6th one slowly, is to fully mobilise the existing set of economic skills. And that is a mobilisation which requires us to take a firm look at the distribution of skills by gender. What we do right now is to educate a generation equally. The women in that generation tend to do better than the men. Men mature slowly as the women go through what notice. About 76, I think, by the time you get them mature. I'm still working on it. But anyway, you get this incredible skill boost in the female population, and then as childcare kicks it, as those women withdraw from the labour force briefly to have their children, then the whole patriarchal structure closes in to make sure that the skills of those women are systematically underutilised. There's glass ceilings everywhere. There's mother traps. There's there's a pressure on, certainly, it is remarkable. Childcare, even in the UK, is so expensive now. The last report I saw was people on median income. By the time you've done childcare for 2 children, one of which was pre-K, I think, you're left with about £20 a week in that second salary, and it wasn't worth going out. We have got to build a new settlement that puts at the heart of the thing the sharing of childcare responsibilities and the ability to do so with massive amounts of support. And that's not something to cut first, that's something to cut last, because that's the core thing that is required. So, you know, we were all a bit depressed by the extent to, no, we were not, sorry, people crazy as me, were depressed by the fact that with a Labour government, Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn, was really a modern equivalent to the Spanish Civil War. You know, the Blairites were trying to get rid of Corbyn, they were telling him, everybody, that Corbyn was unelectable and so on. And then Theresa May, bless her, called a snap election. She was actually leading in the opinion polls by 20 points when she called that election. And by the time it was over, she lost the election. She lost to the majority, and Jeremy Corbyn turned out to be not the devil. And he'd be quite charming and rather English, you know, and rather laid back, and they liked him. But so suddenly the thing started to shift, and of course one of the things that the Labour Party said was, you know, what we're going to do is get back to no college fees and student maintenance. I mean, when I went to university in the 60s, it was the 1860s, not 1960s, and I was paid a wage. I recommend that. So I think, you know, the Labour Party came into play with the proposal that actually struck home with people. Yesterday, we were talking about yesterday, 2 or 3 days before, there was an opinion poll published in the Guardian. It wasn't their poll, it was the independent poll. 2/3 of all Brits, when asked, favour increasing taxation to protect the National Health Service. You are pushing against an open door if you go into social democratic politics in that climate. If you look at the back of this sheet I gave you, there's a whole list of available policies that the Labour Party, in fact, could adopt and is increasingly beginning to adopt. That will actually take us forward to a social settlement in which we can reconstitute prosperity for generations. We'll have to talk about Brexit, of course, now what parameters that does or does not establish. And this list, which you've got in front of you, is an American as well as a British list. The American one certainly needs to shift resources from the military to the civilian sector. We just gave the Pentagon $700 million it didn't ask for, and we can't apparently afford healthcare. So there's another conversation that we're not here. That's completely potty. But there's an active industrial policy, fabulous labour market policy, active civil society policies that can be put in place. So the problem, I'm not as depressed as many people I know, because I do think the policy packages that could be made effective are there. The question is one of whether they'll be delivered. It's been the question of agency, not a question of program. And certainly one of the great tragedies, of course, in the United States is that even though we have Barack Obama in the White House, at the state and local level, the Democratic Party has been losing ground now for a decade or more. I mean, that's a serious problem. But in the UK, and in a sense, we saw that played out in the Clinton campaign, in 2016, and the complete failure to connect to Pennsylvania and the Rust Belt and so on. But due to the snap election in the UK, the move to the left is now much more visibly consolidated. And though you will be watching the German election this weekend, I'm sure, do please keep an eye out for reports of the Labour Party conference to see how that is now, the Corbynites, as it were, are consolidated. If we need to keep that movement going, though, there are 4 final requirements, and I've done that also. So let me turn you back off the policy thing to the other side of the sheet. The 4 blindingly obvious things that need to be continually emphasized. One is that the centre-left will not advance itself in either country by trying to outflank its conservative opponents on their right. If people want genuinely conservative politicians, there are thousands of them. And they're in the Conservative Party in Britain, they're in the Republican Party in the United States. And the centre-left is out of power now, not because it was too radical in the past, but because it didn't make so fundamental a break with neoliberalism that it required. It now needs to shed its own third way path. Now, to this point, let me just say, of course, it's very, very difficult for serious politicians to just say, I've been making a mistake for the last 25 years, because if they do that, the next question that we ask is, how do you know you're not making one for the next 25 years? I mean, it's very, very difficult. In a way, there has to be a generational clean-out. Right? So for those of you in this room who share my politics, go clean it out. I mean, it's got to be a spread, and that's what's happening with the reason Jeremy Corbyn has credibility now is he made no concession to the neoliberal thing at all. The last genuine social democrat standing. And Bernie Sanders is presenting himself in a similar way. I love these two guys. I particularly love Bernie Sanders because he's made men with bald heads relevant again. But he's so, I mean, bless you lot. Keep voting for us till we're in our dotage, but you've got to take it over for yourself. I mean, you've just got to. And a new generation of MPs is increasingly coming in behind Jeremy Corbyn, who are no part of the New Labour thing. It'd be very interesting to watch here in the United States as the Sanders thing develops. Can we have Sherrod Brown? Will we have Harris? I mean, there's a new set, Joe Kennedy III. I mean, there are new people coming through that need all our support. The second big thing to say, if I were where the closing for, is this. Doing that is pushing against an open door because there's a huge electoral army out there waiting for principled progressive politics to be offered again. And what's very striking is not only a huge army, it's also a young one. If you look at the actual demographics of the recent elections, Bernie Sanders in 2016 won more primary votes amongst 18 to 29-year-olds than did Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in both parties together. And in June 2017, this election just gone by, Labour candidates won 63% of the votes of people 18 to 34. 63%. The Tories won 27%. Right? So there's an enormous army waiting, I think. I mean, and I don't know whether any of you were involved in this, but as soon as the Hillary Clinton defeat sunk in, the Women's March was organised in Washington, and that 70 million people didn't turn up, but a huge army of people turned up in Washington that day to demonstrate that there is an enormous audience out there. And what's fabulous about them is all great. They were really fantastic people. So I think the Trump people and even the Brexit people have demonstrated that politics is no longer on. We've got to do something fundamentally different. People are looking for something fundamentally different. And I do think actually amongst young voters in both America and the United Kingdom at least, that there's people are looking for a more principled, progressive politics again. So it's absolutely vital that has happened. Donald Trump is a huge own goal for the Republican right, and Brexit would turn out to be a huge own goal for the British Conservatives. So there is a space opening up which has to be seized. So the question then, thirdly, is how do you seize it? You have to lift your game. And what I think that means for me is there's no tacking to conservative electorates. You've got no choice on the centre left, but to pull the electorate to you, not you chase the electorate. And we do that by offering a clear path forward, progressive policies that people recognise are important, make their life immediately easy, and do what in fact Margaret Thatcher did herself. When she came in, she was brilliant. When she came in, she immediately broke up lots of publicly owned industries and sold them off in bits to make it absolutely impossible to put them back together. People bought their own council houses at subsidised prices to make sure that her principles were sunk into the fabric of the society media and touched people's lives directly. Well, I think that's what any incoming centre-left government's got to do. It's got to strengthen trade unions. It's got to, as its first move, start funding childcare seriously. It's got to legislate on flexible hours. There are a string of things it can do very quickly to make people realise that actually voting for this party actually will make your life better. And certainly I think in the American case, it's got to be a single payer system healthcare or something. It's got to be something. And then finally, this. If a party like that comes in to power, it will meet resistance. So you've got to say, and this is where I think the Corbynite wing of the Labour Party has a very important lesson for the centre-left Germany. Jeremy Corbyn is a man of movements. He's been in every single peace movement, gay rights march, for 25 years. Yeah. There was a time when I took a group of, I'm not being a bitch me, I promise. I took a group of my Wake Forest students to the House of Commons, and I realised I'd never been in the building. I'd always been marching around it, and complaining about one damn thing after another, right? Jeremy Corbyn is a man of the movements. The movements have got to be kept going. There was a huge mobilisation in Washington on January 21st. It was an enormous thing. It's there to be done again. It has to have focus and so on, but we've got to recognise that if we're going to build a new settlement, there will be terrific resistance. I mean, the Koch brothers will go crazy, and we have got to have some counter-arguments of an army of our own. And I just close with this. Go back to where we were at the beginning. It's not the first time in British politics, and it's not the first time in American politics, that the left has been under the cosh. The biggest previous disaster point for the British Labour Party was 1931, when it was a Labour government that abandoned the party and went and formed Andrew MacDonald formed a coalition with the Conservatives. They went to the country and the Labour Party was reduced to a run. And R.H. Tawney, the leading intellectual of the Labour Party in 1931, said this, and I think he's right, and I just want to read something to you. This thing is, 80 years old, but it still seems true to me. He said, if the left is to tackle its job with some hope of success, it must mobilise behind it a body of conviction as resolute and informed as the opposition in front of it. It needs to recognise that the function of a progressive party is not to offer the largest number of carrots to the largest possible number of donkeys. It is not to prophesy smooth things, because support won by such methods is a reed shaken by every wind. It is to ask the question, who is to be the master? It is to carry through at home the measures of economic and social reconstruction which, to the grave injury of the nation, have been too long postponed. It is not to encourage adherents to ask what they will get from a Labour government as though a campaign for a picnic, or beer and sunshine. It is to ask them what they will give. It is to make them understand that the return of a Labour government is merely the first phase of a struggle, the issue of which depends upon themselves. To kick over an idol, you must first get off your knees. And I think we're at that point now, certainly in the British Labour Party's case, and possibly we'll see what happens inside the Democratic Party, where people are needing to get off their knees, commit themselves again, and set their face against the argument that there is no alternative, and to build a better America. It is time for the centre-left to say, we are the